Welcome everyone to the ICNC webinar series. My name is Maciej Bartkowski. I'm Senior Advisor at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. And I'm very delighted to host today Luke Abs, our guest speaker. And today's webinar is titled, Do Nonviolent Movements Aid the Peaceful Resolution of Civil War? Findings from a Global Analysis. And Luke's talk will be based on his forthcoming ICNC monograph titled The Impact of Nonviolent Resistance on the Peaceful Transformation of Civil War. And we have posted the link to the pre-publication copy of the monograph in the chat room of this webinar. So if you are interested in accessing the webinar PDF, please go to the chat room to check the link and download the publication for free. And when I reflect on our collaboration with Luke, I go back to 2019. Luke at that time submitted his proposal for our monograph fellowship. And when we reviewed that proposal, we quickly recognized its value and potential contribution to the field of civil resistance studies. And his initial hypotheses were very exciting, hypotheses about the role and impact of civil resistance in ending civil wars and democratization afterwards. And those hypotheses, if they would be tested, we thought they would be groundbreaking, providing groundbreaking findings. And while we worked with Luke on his study, we wanted to make sure that his writing will also bridge to policy practitioners and action takers. And I think I do believe that's what it happened. His publication is very accessible to general audience and in particular to practitioners. And I believe that Luke's groundbreaking monograph includes eye-opening findings on the impact of civil resistance in civil war context, and will be a great resource for scholars, for activists, for practitioners that are looking for effective solutions to ending civil wars and building sustainable peace. So right now we want to make sure that his unique and valuable contribution to the field of civil resistance will get to the hands of those who work on transforming violent conflicts. So I would like to remind our audience that we are live tweeting from the ICNC Twitter at Civil Resistance, and people can share their reactions using hashtag ICNC webinars. So now I would like to briefly introduce our main speaker. Dr. Luke Abs is a fellow at the Center for Religion, Reconciliation and Peace of the University of Winchester. He has also been Associate Fellow at the Department of Government at the University of Essex since 2018. Luke's research interests include nonviolent resistance and its impact on peace processes. He's also interested in religious peace building, non-state armed actors, United Nations peacekeeping, and mixed qualitative and quantitative methodology. Luke holds a PhD and MA in international conflict analysis from the University of Kent. So now, without further ado, I would like to ask Luke to take over from me and go ahead with presentation and its key findings.
Okay, first of all, I just want to say thank you to Maciej, Steve Chase, Bruce Pearson as well, and everyone else at the ICNC for supporting this project and supporting every aspect of it from the very beginning. It's been an excellent project. I really enjoyed it, and I've really appreciated the support. And I also want to thank Veronique Durdeway, who's done a lot of kind of work in this area and was one of the people who's done work that's inspired this research, and was also very kind enough to invite me to a US Institute of Peace workshop a couple of years ago to present some of my early findings. So this project, essentially this project began with a policy roundtable, I think in 2019, which was organized between Professor Christine Gleditsch and myself and Conciliation Resources, which most people will know is a peacebuilding NGO that's based in London. And we really looked at this subject of, what is this relationship between nonviolent resistance and civil war, And, is nonviolent resistance where it's occurring, is it having a positive effect on the resolution, the peaceful resolution of civil war? And we invited people from different ministries of the UK government. We invited NGOs, different academics, and had this round table, and we didn't really come to a conclusion. There wasn't really much literature on this area. Different kind of NGOs were aware that nonviolent groups were active in different contexts that they were operating in, but wasn't really sure that the impacts that they were having. And there was some skepticism that maybe nonviolent resistance could actually make things worse. So this was really impetus for me to go away and look at this area of research and see if there is a relationship. And straight away, there are some cases that really motivate this as well. Some cases where we have seen this happen. So here is the case of Nepal in 2016 in what is known as the April Uprising. And what we had here was a civil war between Maoist rebels and the monarchist government, which is very repressive. And this kind of civil war went on for 10 years. And then a 7-party coalition came together and formed a nonviolent movement to try and overthrow the monarchy. They managed to encourage the Maoists to join and bring their members into the nonviolent campaign. And within a couple of weeks, what hadn't been achieved after 10 years of armed conflict, they managed to overthrow the monarchy government. And this was really a stumbling block for peace in Nepal. So what this did was really open up political space for the parties to come together and to negotiate peace. And the 12-point agreement that was underpinning the kind of nonviolent movement that brought this coalition together was used as a blueprint for the peace process. And subsequently, we had kind of elections. We haven't seen kind of civil war return in Nepal. I mean, Nepal's had its problems, but we've seen very positive outcomes in terms of a peace agreement, some level of democratization or moving that way, and a lack of kind of conflict reoccurring. So the question is really, is this representative of other cases? And what this monograph is doing is focusing on these nonviolent movements, such as what we saw in Nepal. So this obviously involves the strategic use of nonviolent tactics, such as persuasion. So this is protests, demonstrations, which most of you are aware of, and have seen in other kind of research. Then your kind of non-cooperation methods, so strikes, boycotts, and then your interventions, such as kind of occupations and sit-ins, and the creation of alternative institutions. So it's the use of these different tactics, but within the context of a nonviolent campaign, which has at least 1,000 participants, which is sustained from 1 week to the next, and has maximalist goals against the government to either overthrow the government or to get some level of kind of basically to push for secession. So these kind of maximalist goals using and these big campaigns. So I wanted to look at these movements and see if there is an impact. So what we know currently, so we know nonviolent campaigns that use nonviolent resistance, generally it works. So most of you would be familiar with the work of Erica Chenoweth. We know that nonviolent resistance compared to violent resistance is twice as likely to lead to regime change. We're also more likely to see democratization. We're more likely to see an increase in the quality of democratization. But the question remains, is this potential to achieve change from these nonviolent campaigns, is that also present in the context of armed conflict? The question has not been answered. Secondly, we know that nonviolent resistance is actually present in civil wars. So around 20% of civil war episodes have seen a nonviolent campaign active within them at the same time. There's of course different types of resistance, which we know are very active in many conflict zones. And what this really pulls against is this assumption that civilians are passive actors or not capable of achieving change within these really difficult violent contexts, but of course this is not the case. And then also we have literature on conflict transformation, which has done a lot of kind of excellent conceptual work looking at overlaps between peace building and nonviolent resistance. And essentially they've long argued that they're both very similar and important forms of conflict transformation. So they're both aimed at moving away from destructive conflict, such as armed violence, moving more towards constructive conflict. So really, this is peace by peaceful means. So that they note a number of different kind of conceptual overlaps and various different case studies, but this hasn't been tested in a very kind of empirical way across a large number of cases. So with these kind of unknowns and what needed to be explored, that led to these research questions. So first, do nonviolent campaigns increase the likelihood of negotiated resolution of civil war? So kind of peace settlements. And do nonviolent movements increase the durability of peace and democratization after a civil war has come to an end? So what the monograph is looking at is two phases of the civil war. So active civil war, so there's active armed conflict. There's a number of, there's at least 25 battle-related deaths per year, and essentially the civil war is ongoing. And then looking at the kind of post-conflict phase. So when the armed violence comes to an end, looking at the post-conflict phase and what comes afterwards. So essentially it's looking at these two phases of conflict. So the first, looking in terms of active civil war, what the monograph is interested in is if a nonviolent campaign is active in that context, are we seeing an increased likelihood of a negotiated settlement that ends that civil war? So there's a lot of kind of literature for conflict transformation that argues a few mechanisms. So one is that, again, what I mentioned about moving from destructive to constructive conflict. This idea of nonviolent resistance bringing people together from different kind of social groups, often across kind of conflict lines, and undermining what underpins that, what is driving and underpinning that armed conflict. Essentially opening up political space for some possible dialogue. And the second mechanism is that nonviolent campaigns have the ability to actually change the dynamics of civil war. So often in civil wars, the government is relatively stronger than the rebels. The government has access to all the state resources, has access to an army and everything that comes with that, has legitimacy of like the sovereign rulers of that country. The rebels don't have this. So there's this asymmetry of power in most civil wars. So the argument goes from some conflict transformation scholars that if you can undermine the government, either by overthrowing the government, which happened in Nepal, or forcing concessions, you can kind of change that balance of power and reduce that imbalance in ways that would force the government to, agree to peace talks when it might otherwise not have. So in terms of post-conflict, also looked at durable peace. So this is really looking at peace over a timeline and whether conflict reoccurs or whether that peace continues and goes on and on and on. So, how long is this peace occurring for, and does conflict reoccur or not? And this is a very tricky part of any kind of conflict process, because we know that 60% of civil wars are likely to reoccur within 7 years. And these are very challenging, difficult environments to bring about this kind of positive, durable peace over a long period of time. But we do know that from other studies, that when civil society actors are included in a peace settlement or involved in that peace settlement, there's less likely to be subsequent conflict recurrence when the current conflict comes to an end. And then moving on to kind of post-conflict democratization, which is the aim of many kind of movements. So are we seeing democratization in the post-conflict phase? And with democracy, this brings different factions together, and is aimed at reducing that likelihood of conflict recurring. It's trying to kind of institutionalize the conflicts between different parties, again, in a constructive way, not a destructive way which is driving the conflict in the first place. And we have lots of evidence of how nonviolent resistance leads to democratization, leads to better kind of equality of democracies in different contexts. There's lots of evidence with this, different studies, but we're not really sure how this how this kind of plays out in the context, in the post-conflict context, which is really, really challenging. So this leads to the following proposition. So we'd expect that where there's non-violent campaigns, there should be an increased likelihood of a peace settlement during the civil war. And then when we look at the post-conflict phase, where there was a non-violent campaign in the previous conflict, we should see a reduction in, a reduced likelihood of the civil war recurring at a later stage. And then in terms of post-conflict democratization, where there's non-violent campaigns, we would expect to see an increased likelihood of democratization or transitions to democracy. And I'm not going to talk too much about the methods used. I'm willing to discuss that in the Q&A. So please feel free to ask me a question about that. But essentially, I use 3 different methods. So I use kind of statistical methods, looking at, is there a relationship across a global set of data? I look at prediction. So how much of an effect are these different factors having on these outcomes? And then I look at 2 case studies of Mali in the early 90s and South Africa in the 80s to the early 90s, and see, what's happening in these statistical findings. Are we seeing this play out in these cases that are very different, but which had the same kind of positive outcome? So I'm only presenting, so there's lots of findings in the monograph. I'm only going to present the kind of predictive findings, not because I'm, forcing you guys to go away and read the monograph. That's completely up to you, but more because it's intuitive and probably the best way to present what is a lot of findings in the monograph. So the first finding here, as you can see, is the predicted likelihood of negotiated settlement during the civil war. And as you can see, it's where there's non-violent campaigns, 3 times more likely to have a negotiated settlement compared to cases where there is no non-violent campaign. So there's already good news in terms of that initial finding that there is an effect going on here. Secondly, when I looked at, go into the post-conflict phase, when I looked at the likelihood of civil war recurrence at a later point, here I didn't find anything. So there's no kind of difference whether there was a campaign non-violent campaign in the previous civil war or there wasn't. The outcome is the same. The likelihood of civil war recurring was the same. Now, again, I'm happy to discuss this in the Q&A, but I think what might be going on here is that it's just very difficult to stop civil war from recurring. Once you get into that cycle of civil war, you're already more prone, as studies have shown, to subsequent civil war recurrence. And some other research that I've been looking at, we are suspicious that civil society starts to lose. I mean, the gains that are made through these non-violent campaigns, civil society struggles to maintain them gains and starts to lose influence, later on in a peace process, but also in post-conflict phase. It's very difficult to maintain what's been brought in by the non-violent campaign. Thirdly, so in terms of post-conflict democratization, again, in that post-conflict phase, there's more good news. So essentially, where non-violent campaigns are active, we're more likely to see democratization in the post-conflict phase. So it's 4 times more likely within the first 5 years of the end, the end of the last civil war, and it's nearly 6 times more likely following some sort of peace settlement. So non-violent campaigns, where they are, where they're present compared to cases where non-violent campaigns are not, we're seeing these better outcomes. That's essentially the takeaway from these findings. There are, of course, other findings. So I tried to look at the attributes of the campaigns to dig a little deeper to find out what's going on here, like why is the non-violent campaigns having this impact on peace and subsequently post-conflict democratization. So I looked at a number of factors using the available data. So the first, which is not surprising, is that the size and the diversity, the social diversity of the campaign really does matter, but not just size. It's not just about having mass numbers of people on the streets or mass numbers of people taking part in strikes, etc. it's also about the diversity of the campaign. So I found the more diverse a campaign was, the more likely there was going to be kind of negotiated settlement or this post-conflict democratization. So just visualizing this here, as you can see here, so the more diverse, you see on the horizontal axis here, the more diverse a campaign is along different dimensions, the increased likelihood there was of negotiated settlement. And the picture's the same for post-conflict democratization. And just zooming in one form of diversity, gender diversity, this was also very important. So we know that women have played huge roles in nonviolent campaigns. So one of the most famous is Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace. This, bringing together women from different ethnic groups, different religious groups, across conflict lines. This group came together and protested against the conflict, pushing for initial peace talks, and then engaged in kind of sit-ins, forcing the parties to come to some sort of agreement when they were in formal talks. And obviously the legacy this had in Liberia was huge, with the first female president elected in Africa, and many other factors that come with this. So really gender diversity is good. And as you can see here, campaigns that were more gender diverse were twice as successful or twice as likely to bring about these good outcomes compared to campaigns that were not. And this was the same in terms of the post-conflict democratization. So moving on to a next attribute. So I also looked at organizational diversity, i.e. the number of organizations within a campaign. And this was kind of a mixed bag. So on one hand, in some contexts, this was really, really good, having a campaign that had lots of different organizations within it. So this really worked out in cases like South Africa, where you had very, very strong organizations. You had representing various different groups. So you had the trade unions, you had the democratic movement, you had the ANC that represented many different members, and there was this kind of cohesion between these different organizations. So it kind of worked, and it increased the diversity, played into this notion of social diversity. It increased the diversity of the campaign, so it kind of works out. But in other contexts, it can undermine the campaign if there is infighting. And there's research that's been done by many others. Charles Butcher and Jessica Braithwaite have been looking at organizational diversity more generally in campaigns, not necessarily in the context of civil war, and finding similar findings. The next was, and just to say, organizational diversity, there was no effect during the conflict, which probably because there's these two different factors going on at the same time, but there was some effect for post-conflict democracy. So it did kind of aid democracy in the post-conflict era. The next feature is alternative institutions. So the creation, these grassroots organizations that are created by the movement, which are alternative to the state. So it could be the creation of media outlets, which is what happened in Mali. So they created their own media, their own radio station to get the message out about the campaign, not only in urban areas, but also in rural areas. So again, this played into the diversity of the campaign there. In South Africa, they went further, where they had their own committees that were set up in townships, where they basically organized their own affairs. They organized education and also kind of healthcare, and bypassed the apartheid systems that were clearly discriminatory and wrong. And this really helps to undermine what the state is trying to do. It really helps to undermine, especially state institutions that are very exclusive. Alternative institutions tend to be very inclusive, and it really undermines what the state is trying to do. So this also seems to be an important factor, as you would expect. And lastly, it really seemed to matter the structure of the campaign, or the leadership structure. So this is an ongoing debate on whether hierarchical campaigns are perhaps better placed than decentralized campaigns. This is a subject of debate, but what I essentially found is that it really mattered if a campaign was decentralized. And the reason why is because I mean, if you read the monograph, from the cases of South Africa in particular, it really helped to make the movement adaptable, specifically to state repression. So every time one part of the movement was targeted, so every time the UDF in South Africa was targeted, or in various different ways, either by repression or the leadership was arrested, the different organizations would take that lead role. So the trade organizations then took the role and carried on the protests, carried on the strikes. So every time they tried to target one part of the movement, they simply adapted and another part of the movement took the lead role. The same happened in Mali as well, between the democratic kind of movement, ADIMA as it was known, and the student movement and the trade unions were all taking different roles at different times and were fairly adaptable. So that seems to really matter during the conflict. In the post-conflict phase, in terms of post-conflict democracy, it doesn't seem to matter as much, which is what you would expect. So they're the kind of, there's lots more findings, but that's the kind of overview of what the monograph has found. So in terms of takeaways, so for activists, I mean, the good news is it appears that this form of nonviolent resistance works, and it works in the context of civil war. So, this is good news for activists that are engaging in these activities all over the world. And I'm very aware of these of different activists in different countries that are risking their lives and are doing very good things in different countries. And I really do believe, and I think the findings show, that nonviolent resistance can aid the peace process. So of course, I'm only looking at nonviolent campaigns. There's loads of different types of nonviolent resistance that are occurring. For example, peace movements. There's very localized resistance that's going on. For example, the work that's done on Colombia with the kind of violence prevention approaches that have been carried out in Colombia, trying to reduce violence against civilians. There's all sorts of different nonviolent activity that's going on. And with this research and subsequent research, I am finding positive news. Secondly, different attributes matter. So as I've already suggested, social inclusion is really important. Trying to be inclusive as possible is a key takeaway, and the leadership matters. So having kind of diverse leadership that is decentralized and is flexible. This is not only good for adapting to repression, but also this sharing of power really is good preparation for what comes next and can aid democratization. But of course, I think this needs to be taken with caution. So nonviolent resistance doesn't always work. It increases the likelihood of these positive outcomes, as the evidence in this monograph and other studies that are emerging are showing. But I think there's important lessons to be learned from other cases, thinking about what works, what doesn't, and of course the context in which activists are operating is always different. While strikes worked in South Africa, and because of that dependence on Black workers, it really did work to undermine the apartheid regime. In Mali, it was mass protests in the streets that were really working. And the different contexts require kind of different tactics, which is another area of research that I'm looking at. And I think lessons do need to be learned. Because it doesn't always work. And also activists are working in real time. It's very difficult to figure out what's going on. So, drawing inspiration from other cases, I think is really important, just to sum that up. So for policy, I think this goes some way in perhaps debunking some misconceptions about nonviolent resistance during civil war. So there were concerns that nonviolent resistance could exacerbate the problem, could make things worse. But I really do think the findings here, they do not really suggest that. So of course there might be some cases where nonviolent resistance might not be helpful, and I think there needs to be more research on this, and there obviously needs to be caution from policymakers. But there's a lot of good nonviolent action going on, and there's more and more research coming out now showing that it has a positive effect on peace. And I really think that it should be supported, which really goes to the second point, in that these nonviolent groups in various forms offer a positive alternative to supporting armed groups. you know, this move from destructive to constructive, you know, that aim is really, really important. And if these nonviolent actors and nonviolent campaigns are having a good effect, why not support them? And more research is coming out about the positive effects of external support for nonviolent campaigns. So that's something else to think about. And then lastly, I think too often, and I'm finding in other research, that nonviolent actors are not included in peace building processes or informal peace settlements. There's evidence that where they are, this increases the durability of peace, although my monograph hasn't found that in terms of nonviolent campaigns. So I really do think nonviolent actors can play a role. They understand their context and they should be included in peace processes. And with that, I'll end, and thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Luke. That was excellent, and it gives us a lot of food for thought. And I've got a number of questions, but I want to remind everyone how to ask questions to Luke. You can type your question. You can type your question into the chat room, and you can also raise your hand, and then we will unmute you. We'll ask you to introduce you, and you can then ask your question. So right now, you know, is the moment where you can decide whether you want to raise your hand or type your question. And while you are thinking about that, I want to ask, Luke, I want to kind of go straight to, you know, your mixed finding on civil war reoccurrence, and ask you first, given that the research by Erika Chenoweth and Maria Stefan that seems to suggest something different than what you discovered, where they in fact saw the impact of nonviolent campaigns on reducing the probability of civil war reoccurrence a number of years after the end of the conflict. And why you are addressing this, I wanted also to bring this issue that is there some kind of also contradiction that on one hand there is a visible positive impact of nonviolent campaigns on post-democratization, but not so much on civil war reoccurrence, which might suggest that perhaps that democratization, it's not consolidated, that civil war is reoccurring. What does also, what this, if this is, you know, plausible kind of you know, thought, what that suggests about you know, the quality of the impact of nonviolent campaigns on democratization, if that democratization doesn't consolidate and then there is civil war reoccurrence. And I understand that it has to be, you know, understand in the context that is there any other better alternative that we have out there? Certainly not, violent campaigns don't seem to be a better alternative to what we have, but just focusing on the impact of nonviolent campaigns and this kind of a bit of contradiction that I see here, maybe you can expand on that, and then we'll go to the questions from the audience.
Yeah, certainly. You know, they're two really excellent questions. So I was very surprised when, you know, about this non-finding in terms of conflict recurrence, and it is somewhat contradictory to kind of democratization. I looked at it in various different ways, and it didn't really matter if, you know, how the previous civil war ended, whether it was in a peace agreement. It didn't really matter too much about time either. There just wasn't really an effect. So yeah, I think there's different things going on here. So I am aware of, you know, in Erika's study, they look at recurrence as well, but this is in a broader set of cases. This isn't specifically just in the context of a civil war. So you have a lot of cases where there's been one civil war and not, so essentially not a history of civil war in a certain context. These countries are already not more prone to conflict recurring or a later conflict. So you have cases like that, and then you have cases in terms of civil war where there's continuous episodes one after the other, and it's very hard to kind of break out of that cycle. So this data really is looking at a harder set of cases, so that's probably why the findings are different. And in this harder set of cases, it's clear that the evidence is showing that nonviolent campaigns are not necessarily breaking that cycle for whatever reason. So it could be that campaigns lose their kind of influence, as I've already suggested. Some of these reoccurrences are happening a lot longer down the line. So whether that can be related to what happened to the civil war or not, and whether a campaign was active or not, is a bit of a stretch. But so yeah, it could be that they're not able to consolidate their gains from what they achieved before. So, and maybe their civil society begins to be excluded from certain processes when they shouldn't be, when they could in fact be having a really good positive impact. I really encourage people to look at this and I would be doing this myself, looking at this in more detail to try and understand why there isn't this difference, why a conflict recurrence is the same regardless of whether a non-violent campaign was active or not in the previous civil war. So in terms of that difference between, why is there a positive relationship with democratization, but not, why is there a non-finding with recurrence? I think it really does go back to this consolidation. So it's good to bring in democratization, and I really do think that gives you a good chance. And non-violent campaigns are very good at that, as we've, from this study and also various other studies, people like Jonathan Pinckney and many others have found good evidence for this. But then consolidating that is really difficult. And I think we need to be mindful of what a post-conflict environment looks like. It's often countries that are the poorest nations on earth, often don't have the kind of resources to build these institutions. So you may have, really good ideas and moving towards democracy, but it's really hard to sustain it. So Mali is a really good example where you had a non-violent campaign in 1991. It overthrew the military government within a few months. They subsequently pushed for democracy and they wanted to decentralize power. And in doing so, they were hoping that that would also solve the Tuareg conflict in the north. So giving the Tuaregs more kind of local powers and more autonomy. But in reality, it was very hard to do that because they lacked the resources. So the ideas were there and the democratization was there. And this led to positive vibes in terms of the peace process. It revitalized the peace process. But it was very hard to sustain. So there was another civil war. And then what happened which was quite minor, but then another civil war occurred in 2012, which is very difficult to trace back to what happened in 1991 because of what happened in Libya. So essentially the Libya conflict happened. Lots of Tuaregs went to Libya to fight, and they came back with a lot of weaponry and restarted the rebellion. So what happened across the border was really more to blame for this kind of backslide of what happened in Mali. But again, it was one of the poorest nations on earth. It still is. So it's really hard to consolidate that. I hope that kind of explains why you can still have recurrence even if there's democratization occurring.
No, that's great, Luke. Thank you for that explanation. So I've got a couple of questions that came in. The one that I wanted to read from Suyun Kang, and she says, thank you, Luke. How do you think nonviolent campaigns with violent flanks differ from nonviolent campaigns that partner implicitly or explicitly with armed actors for maximalist change?
Yeah, I mean, another excellent question. So in terms of this monograph, I didn't look at violent flanks. It was one of the, I mean, I looked at so much. It was really hard to decide what to look at and what not. So I didn't specifically look at violent flanks. But I would imagine if you put that into the model, violent flanks would undermine the nonviolent campaign. Simply because, I mean, the findings around the decentralization of a campaign and how that made it adaptable to repression, you'd expect that, if you have a violent flank and that's encouraging more repression, you'd expect that would undermine the nonviolent campaign, especially in the context of civil war and the context of dictatorships that are more than willing to use repression and very violent repression. In other research, I've looked at the role of writing in campaigns and essentially found that campaigns that have rioting or incidental violence, they're more likely to collapse than campaigns that do not. So I think we know from activists, we know from the research, some of the research I've done and other research, that maintaining nonviolent discipline is crucial. So Jonathan Pinkney also has an excellent ICNC monograph looking at this, and essentially like maintaining that nonviolent discipline, you know, making repression backfire or being adaptable to repression seems to be really important. In the context of civil war, I don't know because I haven't looked at it, but I think I certainly will now. So sorry, I can't really provide a definitive answer.
Thank you, Luke. And I would actually encourage you to maybe pursue that research on violent flanks as part of that civil war context and nonviolent campaigns, because in fact it's still there is some research as well as among activists. There is always this discussion that we are exhausting all the nonviolent strategies and tactics that we thought of, and we are still repressed, still the regime is in place, and maybe we should reconsider, and maybe we should use some other more violent methods. So there is the emergence of violent flank occurs also because still activists would have some doubts about the effectiveness of nonviolent methods, particularly if they wage that for quite some time and they don't see seemingly there's no change. So, and then in scholarship also there are suggestions that it may help with escalation, or basically it may make the governments more willing to negotiate with nonviolent movements because they look more reasonable than violent ones. So presence of violent flank might in fact help nonviolent movements in that case. So it would be good if had time and energy to actually explore violent flank as part of your research to see exactly what would be the impact, and then maybe strengthen some arguments on with that subject.
To add to that, Marcia, I think also the importance of external support. So I know there's research being conducted on this. Some good friends of mine are doing good work on this. Yeah, I mean, missing from the monograph as well is also external support. So I think it would be very interesting to see where there's kind of technical or financial support to these movements. Are we seeing kind of better outcomes in these civil war contexts? So really, I mean, the monograph is an exploratory study looking at different kind of factors. There's a lot of unanswered questions that remain. So really, I'm hoping that the monograph will spur research on in this area to look at these different aspects. And I certainly am already looking at different aspects building on from this work.
And just a segue to the external actors, I mean, you might have then answered the next question that came from Andrei through Besic. Is there some causal relationship between success of nonviolent campaigns movements and the variance of heavy external support financing? So I guess that's something that also would need to be still explored as part of the civil, nonviolent campaigns and civil wars.
I think you can see in terms of the case study. So in South Africa, that external support was really important. So I would expect that it would play a crucial role, and this is definitely another project to look into. And it's an important project because it would really push for policy to consider supporting organisations if they are having these positive outcomes. But in South Africa, there was a lot of kind of activism happening abroad, trying to get sanctions against the regime, which all kind of came in. So there wasn't explicit kind of support, but there was more and more support towards the kind of opposition to apartheid, and then the sanctions came in. So this all played a crucial role, as well as what the nonviolent protesters were doing on the ground. So yeah, it's another important area for future research.
Yes, you are taking notes, so there will be a couple of more monographs coming out, right? So there's another question I have from Nick Zaremba. He's asking whether he can perhaps problematize more the types of nonviolent campaigns during civil wars. Do these campaigns tend to be peace campaigns or campaigns that are fighting for similar goals as violent resistance movements, but they are using non-violent means, non-violent resistance. And he says that he's assuming that there might be some mix of both, but perhaps you could develop on that.
Yeah, so the type of campaigns, so this is essentially building on the NAVCO data, which was used by Erica Chenoweth and others, of course. Essentially building on that. So these campaigns are maximalist campaigns. So they're specifically, the specific goal of these campaigns is to either overthrow the government or remove the government, or there's secessionist kind of aims. So these aren't peace movements. There could be some fusion between, peace movements. There could be some sort of cooperation, but broadly they're anti-government campaigns. So they're not mobilized for peace as such. They're mobilized in terms of their goals against the government. Implicit in that could be, aims for peace. So if the monarchy is a stumbling block in terms of peace talks in Nepal, if you remove them from power, and you can see a peace process can emerge from that, then there could be some kind of aspects of peace as part of that. But these are not peace movements. Unfortunately, there's not global data on peace movements at the moment, which is another area which really needs to be looked into. So I know Veronique Derdouet is doing a lot of kind of important conceptual work in this area, looking at different types of peace movements, how they emerge, and I think there's overlaps because these peace movements also use very similar tactics to nonviolent campaigns, but the goals are different. So in Liberia, the women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace, the goal was peace. The goal wasn't to overthrow the government. The goal was to force peace between the two different parties. So they were slightly less partisan. They weren't necessarily anti-government. They were pro-peace. So these are very different cases, but there are overlaps, certainly in terms of tactics, but not. And there could be some overlapping goals, but not many cases really come to mind.
And
so I really think it's an important next area is looking at peace movements essentially, but it's not included in this monograph.
And just related question, did you look at the goals of nonviolent campaigns and how those goals, or depending on the selection of those goals, what was the impact on the likelihood of a negotiated settlement or post-conflict democratization?
Yeah, so I didn't really look at the goals, but what I did look at is, were the campaigns successful in achieving them stated goals? And success was another really crucial factor. As you could imagine, if a nonviolent campaign successfully removes the government, that can completely change the dynamics of a civil war that's occurring in that country. So where campaigns were successful in achieving their goals in overthrowing the government, there was a much increased likelihood of these positive outcomes. So democratization in the post-conflict phase and the peace settlement. I think it was 8 times more likely, so quite crucial.
Thanks. I've got yet another question. It comes from Ches Terber, and he says, "Hi, Luke, great research and great presentation. I was wondering if you look at different types of relationships that civil resistance campaigns may have with the armed combatants. How often are they the same actors, or different actors articulating similar grievances, or are they different actors making different demands?"
Yeah, again, another excellent question. Thanks, Ches. So I didn't specifically look at the links. So I did plan to, but overall there wasn't many links in terms of, there were very different organizations. So in Nepal, the campaign included the Maoist rebels who encouraged its members to join the nonviolent campaign. That's not too typical. Most of the cases are a nonviolent campaign with its own organizations that are separate to the conflict or what's going on. That seems to be more of the norm. Again, in South Africa, there was an overlap because the ANC were using both tactics, violent and non-violent tactics, and were collaborating with the trade unions and the United Democratic Front as part of the nonviolent campaign against apartheid. So they were doing a bit of both. So there is overlap, but it's more typical that there's a campaign going on quite far away from the conflict. So like in Mali, there wasn't really much fusion between the DEMA, which was one of the main kind of opposition movements who was leading the nonviolent campaign. There wasn't too much overlap between them and the Tuareg rebels at all. They had links to the Tuareg region and different kind of civil society actors there, but not to the armed actors. So I think more typical, it's organizations that are totally different and don't have much link to the rebel group.
Thank you. Another question comes from Mary Dalsin, and she's asking, did you parse out the contribution of faith-based religious actors within these non-violent campaigns efforts? Do you know about the research on contributions of faith-based religious actors in track 1 peace processes?
Yeah, I mean, this is another excellent question, and this is an area of research that I'm moving into. An area of research that my centre works on. I didn't specifically look at the role of religious actors in this particular project. It's something I'm going to subsequently do because, I think religious organisations do play a crucial role in some of these processes, and we know there's cases where, religious organisations have gone as far as actually mediating the conflict. So, the Centre Legio organisation and the various conflicts that they mediated, including in Mozambique. So there is a role for these organisations. These organisations are often part of these nonviolent campaigns and supporting these nonviolent campaigns. We know that religious organisations provide safe space for a lot of activists and a lot of organisations. And in some countries really hold a lot of weight, condemning the regime, which in some contexts is really important. In the Philippines, the role of the church was really, really important in this regard. But in terms of this project and what I was exploring, I haven't looked at this specifically. But again, the data on this is not really there, but it's something I'm moving into and keen on looking at. However, I did look in terms of diversity. So one of the diversity factors was whether the campaign was religiously diverse. And this had an important role as well. I think it was somewhere between 2 and 3 times more likely to have these positive effects if there was religious diversity compared to campaigns where they lacked that, which you would expect.
Thank you. I've got Razul who wants to ask a question. So I will unmute him. Razul, please go ahead and ask your question.
I'm Dr. Rasool and my PhD in Peace and Conflict Studies. I'm dealing with Indo-Pak relations on Kashmir, and you might have heard about the Kashmir issue. It is the one of the volatile issue between 2 nuclear neighbors, India and Pakistan. But here issue is a legitimate one, which is being the legitimate one is because UN resolutions are passed to grant a right to self-determination to a movement, but it was absolutely non-violent till 1990. And I want to request to you, what is an alternative in such conditions when both parties confuse the peace? They have their own interpretation as a peace. In some cases, peace is itself being misinterpreted by actors. And what is an alternative that they can continue the non-violent movement?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, it's difficult, right? So different contexts will have different outcomes. As I said in the monograph, these findings are really showing that where there's nonviolent resistance, it's increasing the likelihood of these outcomes. But of course, there's cases where sometimes it doesn't work. So I must confess, I don't know the Kashmir case well enough. So I can't really provide an alternative or explain what might be going wrong in that context. but it could be a number of things. So remaining non-violent is important, and doing so that might actually lead to a positive outcome in the future. But I think that context is really challenging because you know the situation there, you know, between the two different states and the unsettled kind of status of Kashmir. So I think that makes it a really different case, but in a very, very challenging case. So you can think of other cases like in Hong Kong, where, you know, it's very challenging based on the context itself. But also it could be in terms of tactics that are used. So this is research that I'm moving into now with colleagues, looking at how different tactics might work in different stages of a peace process. So certain tactics, we're finding, like in terms of preliminary analysis, certain tactics seem to work better in protesting against violence and reducing violence. Other tactics seem to work better in pushing for peace negotiations, initial negotiations, and then other tactics matter more when you get to the kind of official talk. So it could be that the tactics that are being used, and remember, nonviolent resistance is strategic. So how these nonviolent resistant tactics are being used really matters. How this is being used to undermine the government or whoever's governing the territory, it's very challenging. So I wouldn't really be well placed to, you know, without knowing the context, to explain what a better alternative could be.
And I'll kind of build on that with the question that was submitted by Andrei Trubacek, which is another case study, but maybe you can offer some general thoughts on that. He is asking about the kind of in the current context of Ukraine, an armed conflict with Russia acting as an aggressor, as well as elements of civil struggle, polarization on values, ideologies, geopolitical orientation. What recommendations your monograph could offer to non-violent anti-militarist movement in such context? I think what was pointed with regard to Kashmir was the issue of also a different interpretation. I guess what peace means by different groups that might be striving for peace in that conflict. So basically, in the context of that question about Ukraine, we've got also polarized, according to the person who is asking the question, polarized on values, ideologies, geopolitical orientations, and what kind of recommendations you think your monograph can offer in that context?
Yeah, so I think the Ukraine case, again, it's quite unique in which, we have a non-violent campaign which emerges in the capital and other places, and then leads to some sort of armed rebellion, which obviously occurred in the east in Ukraine. These kind of cases are quite rare. So, for example, in Syria, where you had the non-violent campaign, and then essentially you had defection from the army and rebel groups formed, and it basically turned violent. So these are kind of unfortunate cases. But I think it's, in terms of the Ukraine case, it's difficult because it's about secession. So one thing I did find is that, and others have found, that secession cases are a lot more challenging than cases that are aimed specifically against the government. These are always more of a challenge. And one of the problems with Ukraine is, the geographical distance between what's happening in the capital and the east. And what I found in my research is that what really works is where you're able to mobilize a campaign, but whether that would, in this context, is for anti-government, but whether that would be for peace, like in terms of a peace movement. What seems to matter is mobilizing different social groups and mobilizing across conflict lines. I think that's very challenging to do in kind of secessionist conflicts, and the fact that there's that distance between Russians in the east and Ukrainians in the west, it's difficult to gauge that, to bridge that kind of gap. So I don't really have an answer, and the monograph doesn't really look at these cases that are quite rare. It's a difficult one, really.
Thank you, Luke. In fact, we have reached our time. I mean, your presentation and responses to the questions, I mean, for me, were very revealing. I learned additional things that I already knew from your monograph, but I still learned quite a lot from this webinar and from your responses to the questions. And I would like to thank you for that. I would like to thank our audience as well. And just a reminder, you can download for free Luke's monograph pre-publication copy going to the chat room, and you will have the link you will find there the link to that monograph draft pre-publication version. And you can also be interested in joining us in the coming weeks for the upcoming webinars that we have, all related to civil resistance, the impact thereof on different aspects of conflict. So we would like to encourage you to check. The forthcoming one is in June 16, and the link also was placed, a registration link for that webinar was placed in the chat room on how the movements acquire and harness the resources they need to sustain and grow. And this is the case studies from Northern Mexico and Palestine, Area C. So another exciting, I think, and groundbreaking research that follows Luke's excellent monograph. So, Luke, again, I would like to thank you for being with us. We have recorded that webinar, and we will be sharing the recording of the webinar with those who registered, and together also with the link to your piece. So once again, I would like to thank the audience, and I wish everyone a good day. Stay well and safe. Thank you, everyone.